Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please break into the like button's water supply and fill it with permanent red dye. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At about 8:20 in the morning on June 29th, 2025, an 83-year-old woman named June Baxter shuffled her way down the hallway of her small home in Attleboro, which is a quiet town in eastern England. As she walked, she had to keep one hand on the wall to keep her balance. She was pretty frail these days and also just had a lot of medical problems. But she also really valued her independence, and so she was determined to keep living alone, even if it was kind of risky. So June used to live with her husband and their dog. But about 7 years earlier, her husband had gotten really sick, and so because of that, they'd had to give their dog to their granddaughter because they just couldn't take care of it anymore and also care for him. And then unfortunately, June's husband did pass away, and so she was left all alone. But even though she was, all alone in terms of living in the house by herself, she wasn't completely isolated. Her granddaughter, who she had given the dog to, lived close by and visited a whole bunch, and almost always brought along June's old dog, which June loved. Now, in addition to just being good company, June's granddaughter also regularly made herself available to help June with all sorts of basic things, like, picking up her prescriptions and going grocery shopping for her and, driving her to and from doctor's appointments. Like, she was really available to her. But despite June knowing that, knowing she could always call on her, she tried hard not to call on her granddaughter, because again, she just really liked being independent. So on this particular day, she, continued slowly walking down the hallway, guiding herself by holding onto the wall, and then she turned the corner to go to the bathroom. And when she stepped inside, she slipped on the tile. And as she was falling to the ground, her leg scraped the corner of the bathroom counter. Immediately, June's leg started bleeding and June's yelling out in pain, but she lives alone, nobody can hear her. And so June quickly went from, just reacting to the pain and the blood. June was scared. I mean, this is the exact scenario that she was so worried about, getting hurt when she was all alone, because she didn't really have a plan. It was like, I'm gonna live alone, so help me. But fortunately for June, she had installed throughout her house all these emergency call bells that would allow her to basically, hit the bell, and they were programmed to contact both her granddaughter and also the local emergency services. And in the bathroom, there was one of these bells. And so once she kind of composed herself a little bit, grabbed the string for this bell, and she pulled it. About 10 minutes later, June was still in the bathroom on the ground, holding onto her leg wound, when she heard the front door of her house swing open. And immediately she heard the sound of her granddaughter calling out for her. And June, as best as she could, even though her voice was a little bit weak, she called out and said where she was. A moment later, June's granddaughter, along with June's old dog she'd brought along, came bombing around the corner, and they looked into the bathroom and they saw, June and her horrible leg wound. And clearly the granddaughter is really worried right away. I mean, this was a very bad cut. But, for June, she's looking at her granddaughter and she's just flooded with relief because she knows no matter how bad this is, her granddaughter is here. Everything's fine, and also her dog was here, which made everything better already. And so while June's granddaughter began rummaging through the bathroom to look for some bandages, June just kind of relaxed and just began petting her dog, who was clearly very worried about June. This is her dog previously. They had a very strong bond. And so she's just petting her dog, and then, June's granddaughter did find some bandages, and she wrapped up June's leg. And then by the time the paramedics got there, June actually was feeling basically okay. I mean, her leg definitely hurt, but she was very calm at this point. A couple of minutes later, the paramedics arrived, and by this point, June was actually feeling basically back to normal. I mean, her leg definitely still hurt, but again, her granddaughter had put that dressing on it and basically stopped the bleeding, and also June has her dog that she's petting, like her comfort animal, and so she was very calm. Paramedics come in and they assess her and they take off the dressing to check the wound. And after they cleaned it, they said, look, this is a pretty minor cut. You don't even need stitches. I think you're okay, just be careful and maybe have your granddaughter stay here for a little bit just to make sure you don't fall again, but you're okay, like we're gonna go. And so June, she thanked the paramedics as they walked out the door, and then she and her granddaughter and the dog just sort of sat there feeling grateful that this fall wasn't more serious. However, the next morning when June woke up, she knew something was wrong. Because, all she's doing is laying in bed, but her heart is racing, she's sweating, she's lightheaded, like clearly something is off here. Now, the day before, after the paramedics left, her granddaughter did stick around for a little bit, but really, June was okay, and so June was alone. And that night, she had some soreness around the cut, but it really wasn't that serious. She really felt like dodged a bullet there. But now, 12 hours later, something's going on here. Now, June had no way of knowing if her current symptoms were indeed connected to her, minor cut on her leg. But her concern that maybe this was serious and could potentially spiral really quickly made her not pull on one of those emergency bells, but instead she just picked up the phone and called an ambulance to take her to the hospital. When she got to the hospital, doctors immediately began running all these tests on her. And very quickly, they determined that she did have a very severe bacterial infection, which she must have gotten after cutting her leg. And unfortunately, that infection had already spread into her blood, which would explain why she was feeling sweaty and lightheaded and why her heart was racing. Now, the medical staff definitely had some questions, like how in the world could this have developed so quickly, especially after the paramedics the day before had, at least according to them, properly cleaned this wound before they left. But, their issue now was not how did this happen, but instead just stabilize June, treat her. And so right away, they began treating June with general antibiotics to try to fight off this infection. But it just wasn't working. And June was 83 and already in relatively poor health, and her condition was clearly deteriorating rapidly. So the doctors began running more tests to try to determine exactly what type of bacteria was causing this infection. Because if they knew that, they might be able to give her more targeted treatment than just general antibiotics, which clearly were not working. And they did eventually identify this bacteria. But by the time they did, June had unfortunately already developed sepsis, which is a life-threatening condition that occurs when a person's body tries so hard to fight off an infection that it basically ends up damaging their vital organs in the process. Medical staff did everything they could, but it wasn't enough. And so eventually, 1 week after going to the hospital, June passed away. It would turn out the deadly bacteria that found its way into June's open wound was introduced to her by her granddaughter, completely by accident. The bacteria is called Pastorella multicida, and it's found in a very specific place, inside the mouths of domestic dogs. While June laid on the bathroom floor waiting for her granddaughter to find bandages to wrap up her leg, June's old beloved dog, who her granddaughter had brought over, was trying to comfort June, and June was allowing the dog to do that. But what the dog was actually doing to comfort June, was licking her open wound. And so that led to the bacteria going in, and it would kill June 1 week later. On the afternoon of March 4th, 2000, a 40-year-old woman named Ines Ramirez stood in the kitchen of her tiny one-room home, which was deep in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico. Ines had a whole chicken on the counter right in front of her that she had just killed and plucked, and now she was using a 6-inch-long knife to butcher it for their dinner. And as she did this, every once in a while, she would look out the window to check on her 7 kids who were playing together out in the yard. So Ines and her large family lived in a very isolated rural community of about maybe 500 people. They didn't have running water or electricity or a phone, and they lived miles away from their closest neighbors. They mainly lived off of corn and vegetables that they grew themselves, chickens they raised, and then wild animals that Ines's husband would catch. Her husband was actually gone that day because he was out in the mountains hunting for deer. And so as Ines is just kind of going about her fairly typical evening routine here, making dinner, she suddenly felt this really intense, very painful cramping sensation that was kind of ripping through her abdomen. And it hurt so bad that Enos stopped what she was doing and kind of doubled over and grabbed the counter and just tried to steady her breathing. I mean, this was really shocking. And for about a minute, Enos just stood there, holding onto the counter, just waiting for this pain to pass, and eventually it did. And once it eased up, it was like, okay, she was back to normal and she could stand up again. But this was sort of alarming. But at the same time, Enos was used to dealing with basically all medical crises on her own. They lived in this isolated part of the world, and the nearest medical clinic was 50 miles away, and they didn't have a car. So, like anything that happened, they basically had to deal with it themselves, and that was routine. And so for Enos, despite how incredibly painful this was, she just told herself, like, now that it had passed, the pain was gone, she said, you know what? It's probably fine. Like, I'm good. And so pretty quickly, she just kind of forgot about it and went back to butchering the chicken. But several hours later, this is after midnight now, the pain came right back. And at this point, Enos, she's in this one common room in her house where all her kids are fast asleep. It's past midnight now, and she's sitting on this bench and she's gripping her abdomen, rocking back and forth as this pain just rockets back and forth across her abdomen constantly. There's no relief, nothing. And she's trying so hard not to make a sound because she doesn't want to wake her kids up, nor does she want to scare her kids. Her husband is still off in the mountains hunting for deer, so she is alone. She just has this little flickering candle nearby. That's the only light she's got, and she's just isolated, dealing with this excruciating pain. And so at this point, Enos really felt like this could be a real problem. This might not be something she could just brush off and let pass on its own. This was real. This was an actual emergency. But what can she even do? There's nowhere to go. She can't do anything. She is just completely trapped here with this excruciating pain that's making it hard to even have coherent thought. It's so bad. But the one thought that kept going through her mind was she had to do something, or whatever this was. It felt like it was going to kill her. And so Enos felt like she really only had one option here, and it was a horrible, horrible option. But she knew she had to do it. And so she got up and she's hunched over in pain, and as quietly as she could, she walked over to a cabinet and she opened it up and she grabbed a small bottle of alcohol and she took a few sips to kind of numb the pain a little bit. And then after she had done that, she turned around and, still with this blinding pain, she hobbled into the kitchen and she grabbed that 6-inch knife she had used earlier to butcher the chicken. And then she walked right back over to the bench near that candle that she'd been sitting on earlier. And once she was there, she reached down and she pulled up her shirt, exposing her abdomen, where this pain was coming from. And then she took the knife and she plunged it into her abdomen. And immediately she let out this blood-curdling scream. She couldn't help it. And she was sort of vaguely aware of all her kids waking up and sort of making their way over to her, but she was so focused on what she was doing, and she began slowly dragging this blade down her abdomen all the way to her belly button. And then she pulled out the knife and she can barely think. It's so painful. Her kids are crying. And then she plunged the knife back into her abdomen and raked it down the other side, creating this massive gash in her stomach. And then she kind of dropped the knife and she's screaming. She can't even help it. And her kids are all crying. And she takes her hand and she reaches into her stomach and she's fishing around. Every little move is like lightning striking her body. But she eventually finds what she's looking for and she pulls it out of her stomach. And what she's looking at is her 8th child, a baby boy. And she had enough wherewithal to take that knife and cut the umbilical cord and place the baby down before she passed out. After Enos lost consciousness, one of her kids left the house and just started running to go find the nearest person to get some help. And miraculously, after finding some people, when those first responders got to the home where Enos was hours later, they found her and her newborn son alive. And they were taken to the closest hospital for emergency treatment, and they would both make full recoveries. Today, Enos Ramirez is the only woman ever who has performed a successful C-section on herself. In the early morning hours of December 3rd, 1921, A 62-year-old woman named Augusta Roblin lay awake in her bedroom inside of her daughter's house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Augusta had lived with her daughter now for about a year. She had moved in after her husband had passed away. She just really hated being alone, and at night in particular, it was difficult to sleep sometimes. Just the weight of the loneliness was very intense. And also, Augusta was known to have really visceral bad dreams, and so that, combined with loneliness, made living alone really awful. So here she was, living with her daughter. But on this particular night, Augusta, she was wide awake in bed because she had had one of these awful nightmares, but she knew she could not tell her daughter about it. Now, normally one of the ways that Augusta would cope with these terrible nightmares, even when she was living alone, is she would get in touch with her daughter and they would talk about it. They would try to figure out if there was meaning in this awfulness of these nightmares. And sometimes they felt like they did find deeper meaning, and it sort of was cathartic for Augusta. But on this night, the dream she had just had, this nightmare, this visceral, awful nightmare, she knew, based on what she believed it meant, she absolutely could not tell her daughter anything about it. She had to hide it at all costs. In the dream Augusta had just had, she kind of came to, and she was in her daughter's basement. So in the basement of the house she was in right now. And in front of her on the ground were these two perfectly circular, very, very deep holes, just that went straight into the ground. And so Augusta, she found herself walking towards the edge and looking over. And she saw it was like this unbelievable abyss in each hole. It's like it went on into infinity. But despite this innate fear she had for these holes, she sat down on the edge of one of these holes and basically dangled her feet over this, cataclysmic abyss below her. And as she's sitting there like a child dangling her feet, these two men in dark clothes, they wander over out of the shadows and they walk behind Augusta. They don't interact with her, and they go to the other hole, the hole that is next to Augusta. And she looks at these men, and they're not looking at her. They're doing something. They're clearly in the middle of some sort of act. And they pull this huge carpet seemingly out of nowhere, and the two men stretch it out over this other hole next to Augusta, and they lay it over the hole. And as soon as Augusta saw that, she suddenly understood what was happening here, and she was horrified. So she woke up. And now here she was, knowing that based on what she just saw in her mind's eye in this horrible nightmare, that she could never share it with anyone, that she would live with the secret. So Augusta would eventually fall back to sleep that night, and she would get up in the morning and she would not tell her daughter, Henrietta, anything about this dream she had had. She played it off like everything was just fine. But over the course of the day, Henrietta, even though she didn't say anything, began to notice that her mom was just acting really weird, like something was on her mind. And finally, at night, when the two of them sat down for dinner, this is basically, 24 hours, give or take, from when Augusta had this dream, right? They're sitting down for dinner, and Augusta, she's not eating, she seems totally disconnected, and she just seems off. And Henrietta's like, "Mom, what is going on with you?" And Augusta, at this point, realized she must be giving off very negative vibes here. And so she told her daughter, "Don't worry, I'm fine, I'm sorry, I'm not hungry. Everything's fine, I'm just feeling a little bit off. So everything's fine." But Henrietta realistically did not believe her mom, but she didn't push her. She said, okay. And they finished their dinner, and then before long, Augusta had gone to bed. But the next morning, when Henrietta got up, she went downstairs expecting to see her mom, but Augusta was nowhere to be found. And so again, feeling kind of concerned about her mom's behavior, she went to Augusta's bedroom to check on her, and she found her mom seeming really weak and lethargic and just totally out of it, laying in bed. And she asked her mom, really, what's going on with you? Are you not feeling well? What's happening here? And her mom just said, I just don't want to get out of bed. I'm feeling under the weather. I'm going to stay here. But even though Henrietta could see her mom was clearly downplaying this, she just felt like there's too many red flags. So she called a doctor. And a doctor came to the house, and a doctor examined Augusta, and they determined that, it wasn't really clear exactly what was going on with her. Clearly she's not feeling great, but the only thing they found was that her heart sounded a little bit weak. And so the doctor suggested that Augusta just, rest, have some water, eat some food, and just stay in bed, and you should get better. But despite Augusta doing what the doctor said and basically remaining on bed rest, she didn't get better. And in fact, Henrietta, her daughter, is watching, and she's clearly seeing that not only is her mother deteriorating physically, but she was also becoming more and more despondent and sort of disconnected emotionally. It was like she was drifting off into some other world that Henrietta was not a part of, and she was just so worried about her mom. And so finally, on December 7th, so this is for reference, 5 days after Augusta had that visceral nightmare that she felt like she couldn't share with anybody, Henrietta went into her mother's room and she sat on the edge of the bed and she said to her mom, "You gotta tell me what's going on. It seems like there's something else here that you're not sharing with me. You gotta tell me. I don't care what it is, but I gotta know." Augusta, when she heard her daughter saying this, she sort of thought about trying to keep doing the same thing she was doing, which was, basically say everything's fine and push her daughter off. But she could tell Henrietta was not gonna take that for an answer. And so Augusta sighed and she said, "I had that dream again. Except this time, I watched the procedure." Now, to us, this is, cryptic and weird and doesn't really mean anything. But to Henrietta, who understood what her mom was talking about, she was completely horrified. It would turn out Augusta really did have horrible nightmares that plagued her for at least the last year or so. But it was like a recurring nightmare. She didn't have different variations. It basically was the exact same nightmare that just really upset her. The way it went is, she would open her eyes in this nightmare, and in front of her would be these two bottomless pits, these huge holes in the ground. Now, she wouldn't know what these holes are, but she'd be able to tell that she was in an environment that she recognized. One time she saw that she was in her sister-in-law's garden. Another time she saw she was in her neighbor's backyard. She knew where she was, but she didn't understand these holes. But in this nightmare, she would always walk up to the holes, and then she, not two men who walked in, but she would take a rug out and cover up one of those holes, and then she'd wake up. Now, on its face, this does not sound like a particularly frightening dream. But there's a connection to the real world that made it frightening. Every time Augusta would have these nightmares, the person who lived at the property where the dream took place, the sister-in-law's garden, the neighbor's backyard, when she would have that dream, she would come to, and then within a couple of days, that person would die, usually inexplicably. It was like a harbinger of doom that these dreams represented who was going to die next. And so every time she had this dream, she knew someone's going to die. But in that last dream she had, the one, 5 days earlier that scared her so badly, she knew she couldn't tell Henrietta. In that dream, it was the first time she, Augusta, didn't perform the procedure, i.e. putting the rug over one of the holes. Those two men came over and they did it. And Augusta realized she's sitting with her feet in the other hole, and she's realizing she's in her daughter's basement. That's where this dream's taking place. This must mean she, Augusta, is next. And wouldn't you know it, just days after telling her daughter about this, within 2 weeks of having this dream, Augusta died of heart failure in her daughter's house. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today's story is about a fiction writer who used her own life as inspiration for her books. However, as she would find out, some stories are better left untold. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's coffee creamer with white paint. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of June 1st, 2018, 68-year-old Nancy Crampton Brophy sat in bed with her computer on her lap in the home she shared with her husband in the suburb of Beaverton, Oregon. Nancy was trying to work on her newest book, but for some reason, she just couldn't focus on the chapters she was writing. So Nancy was a romance writer who had actually finished 11 novels, and she also ran a blog with some other romance writers who lived in the area. Now, writing really was Nancy's passion, and she'd been doing it her whole life. But despite that, she really had not made any real money from writing. She'd never gotten a legitimate publisher to buy one of her books, so those 11 novels she did, well, they had to be self-published, and basically had to be free online for anybody to read them. And so, in order to keep on writing, she had to have a day job to pay the bills. In the past, she'd run a catering company, but now she worked for Medicare. However, despite not having made it big, at least not financially as a writer yet, it didn't deter Nancy. I mean, she was totally motivated to keep on writing because she believed that, the next thing she wrote was going to be the thing that finally made her a bestseller and made her famous and financially stable on her writing. However, tonight, Nancy just felt completely stuck. She could not think of what to write next. So she leaned back into her pillow and just thought about what her character was going through and tried to think if she'd ever gone through anything similar that might inspire, what would need to happen next in the story. So these romance epics that Nancy wrote were very over the top, but she did draw a lot of inspiration from her actual personal life. Most of her work featured very powerful women and had similar themes like freedom and strength and love because Nancy really valued all those things in her own life. The other things all her books had in common was they always had happy endings. And Nancy knew all about happy endings because in some ways, she was living one. Nancy and her husband, Dan Brophy, had been married for almost 25 years. They had both been married before, and Dan actually had a son and granddaughter from his first marriage. And so the fact that Nancy and Dan had found each other after essentially both of them had been living what, felt like very complete lives to that point, felt like another theme that she wrote about all the time, which was this idea of fate, as if fate is the thing that brought Nancy and Dan together. Dan and Nancy even called themselves soulmates, sort of playing on this idea that really fate had led them together. I mean, they had fights and disagreements like any other couple, but they also knew each other so well that sometimes Nancy felt like they could almost read each other's minds, and that sort of got them through any rough patches. And also, another part of the reason that they seemed to work so well together as a couple was because they gave each other plenty of space to pursue their own interests. They were, given freedom, something again that Nancy really valued. And so for Nancy, her sense of freedom, her sense of, being able to pursue what she wanted to, meant shutting herself away every evening in their little attic bedroom for hours and hours to write. And for Dan, his sense of freedom and his ability to pursue his own interests meant working long hours at a career he loved as a chef and a teacher at the Oregon Culinary Institute. Just like Nancy was sort of obsessed with writing, Dan was obsessed with food and cooking. And when he was not in a kitchen, he was often out in the backyard of his and Nancy's house, raising chickens and working in his garden, or maybe on a trip into the Oregon woods to forage for mushrooms. But tonight, despite how happy Nancy's life was and how secure she felt in her own relationship, none of that really mattered relative to what she was trying to do, which was write this book. She just was not able to do it. And as she continued to struggle with writer's block, her mind kind of spiraled off into more sort of pessimistic thinking, and she began thinking about, the money problems that recently had begun to take a toll on both her and Dan. Neither Nancy nor Dan had ever made particularly high salaries, and their finances had always been pretty tight, so that was kind of normal for their relationship. But about 2 years ago, they'd gotten really behind on credit card debt, and that extra debt threw everything else out of whack, and at one point they actually had not even been able to afford their mortgage. Now, realistically, things were actually more under control now. Nancy and Dan had taken a chunk of money from Dan's retirement account to pay off some of this debt, and they'd also made the decision to sell the house they were in now, and downsize, which Nancy actually was kind of excited about. With these lower overhead costs, it would likely mean that she would get to quit her day job and just pursue her passion, writing, and also pursue being the best grandmother she possibly could be. So in a way, things were starting to look up, at least in terms of, their financial situation. But Nancy knew, especially tonight, that she couldn't just forget about the fact that they had these problems. She couldn't just pretend they weren't there. In fact, tonight, the reason Dan was not home when normally he would be is because recently Dan had picked up a second job cooking for an assisted living facility, and he had picked it up to help pay off this debt. So it really was sort of beginning to infect their whole lives, this debt. He was working for a friend of theirs. It was a woman whose name was Tanya Medlin. And the job wasn't bad exactly, but it definitely was not Dan's dream job either. But just then, as Nancy's having all these kind of conflicting and sort of bad thoughts, she heard the front door open and realized that Dan must be home. So she slammed her laptop shut, figured she would attack this later, and she went downstairs to meet him. Nancy got to the front door just as Dan was taking off his boots and coming into the house. And she quickly gave him a kiss and asked how his shift went. But Dan just kind of grunted and said, fine. And then he disappeared into the kitchen to make some food. Dan had always been a pretty gruff person, but to Nancy, it was sort of part of his charm. He was blunt and a little socially awkward, but his love language was food. And so he made her elaborate meals to show her that he cared about her, and she knew that. Nancy did know that other people didn't really understand Dan and often took his mannerisms and gruffness the wrong way. In fact, at the last school where he taught, he'd gotten fired because of his bad attitude. And at the Culinary Institute where he was currently teaching, a group of students had complained that he was way too tough and had impossible standards. Now, Nancy did worry about this. She understood Dan, she knew what he was like. But, the reality here is that if he loses his job or multiple jobs here, they're going to be in a bad spot financially. And again, they have these financial problems that they're working through, but that would be really bad. And then also on top of that, this was sort of buried in the back of Nancy's mind, is she had this fear that, Dan was going to upset the wrong person. It just seemed like he kind of made people mad everywhere he went. And who knows? A student could snap and try to hurt him. And so maybe it was just the stress kind of coming through as she can't write and they have money problems. But on this night, she just had this feeling of like, I hope he's going to be okay here. I hope he isn't going to make more people mad and jeopardize his own safety. And so Nancy goes to Dan in the kitchen and she kind of tries to lighten the mood and just ask him how the day went, nothing too crazy. But she noticed that Dan's attitude was really bad. Even by his standards, he was really being quite rude. And Nancy knew that very likely the reason for this is because he had to work the second job because they were in debt. And so Nancy tried to be understanding, but as Dan got grouchier and grouchier over the course of the next few minutes, Nancy just started to feel like he was being rude to her and it was totally unnecessary. And it's like, she's in this with him. Why are you treating me so badly? Eventually, Dan finished making his snack and it was big enough that he put some on a plate for Nancy as well and he handed it to her. And this made Nancy smile, even though she was kind of annoyed with Dan. Because it felt like, oh, the old Dan's back. Giving me food is his way of showing me he loves me. And so they ultimately sat down together and they ate and they chatted a little bit before Dan said, I'm tired, I'm going to bed. Just before 5 a.m. the next day, so June 2nd, Nancy woke up to the sound of Dan banging around in their bathroom. Nancy liked to sleep in when she could, and today she could. But Dan, he couldn't, because he had a lot to do that morning, so he was up. That day, he had to go to his school, the Oregon Culinary Institute, to set up the classroom before his students got there, and then also teach that day. And then before that, he also had a list of chores that he did around the house before work, like feeding his chickens. Nancy tried to fall back asleep, but Dan, frankly, was too loud. And at this point, she was kind of back in some negative thought loops, and she couldn't sleep. And so she laid there, and she began thinking in particular of all the negative thoughts about the book, that she just couldn't continue to write this book. It was like she really had writer's block. And she had not really experienced that in previous novels. This one was just really, really challenging. And so after tossing and turning for a few more minutes, feeling really frustrated, she decided she would just get up and go take a drive and just clear her mind. This was Nancy's go-to. Whenever she needed to work out a storyline or plot hole, she would just hop in her car and drive around and just kind of let her thoughts wander. And this morning, she knew exactly where she wanted to go. She wanted to go to this very beautiful neighborhood with streetcar tracks and tree-lined roads in the nearby city of Portland. So up and out of bed she got. She found Dan in the bathroom and said bye to him, and then she went outside, got in her car, and she was off. Less than 20 minutes later, and Nancy was in Portland. In particular, she was in the neighborhood that she thought was beautiful, and it was this area near a place called Washington Park. And so it's got beautiful foliage, and there's all these beautiful homes, and it's just this wonderful area. And she's driving around, just kind of looking out the window, enjoying herself. And then she had this sort of pang of jealousy because Dan's school, where he worked, was roughly in this area, and so he got to go through here every morning, and she suddenly felt like, man, I wish I could do that. However, as she continued to drive around Portland, she began to see other sides of the city that she herself did not necessarily think were so great. In particular, she drove through an area where there were all these tents on the streets, where people who were displaced or potentially homeless, that's where they were living. And, they were making the best of it, but from her perspective, this represented danger. And in fact, there'd been a whole lot more drug and criminal activity in this area lately that sort of coincided with more and more of these tents popping up around town. And this had actually really bothered Dan. He was worried about this. However, the way Dan had responded, ultimately, beyond just telling Nancy about his concerns, is he had recently started this outreach program where he took extra food from his school and he gave it to a local church to help feed the homeless. Now, Nancy and Dan both thought this was a great idea, and it seemed like, giving back in that way was exactly the right way to respond to what really amounted to a homelessness crisis in the city. But for Nancy, who worried about Dan, she couldn't help but feel like, I kind of wish he wasn't really getting involved. Like, I don't really want him in this part of town. I want him home and safe, or just at his school and safe there. And she just had this growing sense of dread that something was going to happen to Dan. But as Nancy is having seemingly like 10 thoughts all at once in all different directions, she suddenly has an epiphany. She has this moment of absolute clarity about how to write her book. It was like all these elements came together and were showing her the way. And so in an instant, she turned back around and she drove back home to get to work. When Nancy got back to her house, she saw that Dan was already gone, which meant he was off to work at the Culinary Institute, which meant Dan was sort of, back into the dangerous part of town, potentially, surrounded by these homeless people that could potentially harm him. At least that's where her head was going. But she told herself she needed to focus, she needed to just do the writing while she had this moment of clarity. And so she rushes up to her bedroom and she spends the next 2+ hours just writing nonstop. But then at around 10 a.m. that morning, her concentration was broken when her cell phone rang. And when she answered it, she was very surprised to hear one of Dan's colleagues from the Institute on the other line. And the colleague sounded totally frantic, and she told Nancy that Dan was not at the school, and she had heard there was a shooting at the school this morning. And so she was just worried about Dan. She had to make sure he was okay. She said she had tried to call Dan to see what was going on, but he hadn't answered, and so she was hoping that Nancy would know where he was. When Nancy heard this, it was like immediately her mind exploded with all the worst possible case scenarios that could be playing out here. But, she took a deep breath and tried to stay calm, and she told this colleague, although she was not confident this was true, but she told the colleague, likely Dan is just in the middle of a lesson, and that's why he's not picking up his phone. He's probably just fine. The colleague sort of agreed and decided they would sort of wait and see if maybe Dan got back in touch with them. But as soon as Nancy hung up the phone, she threw her laptop aside and ran downstairs and turned on the TV. And as she was flipping through channels looking for the news to find out more about the shooting, she also grabbed her phone and called Dan. But it rang and went to voicemail. So she hung up, she tried it again, but again he didn't answer. And so she texted him, but he didn't text back. At this point, the news was now on the TV. And as Nancy took stock of what she was seeing on the screen, she was horrified. Because it was all these images, from helicopters and from reporters showing Dan's school with all these police and all these news crews outside. I mean, clearly something had happened at the school. And she had just spoken to the colleague who said there was maybe this shooting. And so she raised the volume to see if they would maybe say, was it a shooting? Did somebody get shot? Who got shot? Who did the shooting? What happened? But nobody was saying anything that clarified it, just that something had happened at the school. And so at this point, Nancy couldn't wait any longer. She grabbed her keys, rushed out to her car, and she sped towards Dan's school. Less than 20 minutes later, Nancy drove through that same beautiful neighborhood that she had been in that morning in Portland. But this time, instead of admiring the scenery, she was laser focused on trying to find out if Dan was okay. She was calling and texting him, and she was cycling through the radio to hear any news broadcast about what had actually happened here, to make sure Dan was not involved in it in any way. But at this point, all she had learned from the news was that there really had been a shooting at the Oregon Culinary Institute. But that was it. There was no other information. And so by the time Nancy actually got to the school, She was such a nervous wreck. She was so anxious. She was nauseous. Her hands ached from having white-knuckled the steering wheel on the drive over. I mean, she was a mess. As Nancy looked around, all she saw was this sea of police officers and other first responders, and all this crime scene tape had been put out, and all these reporters. I mean, it was total madness. But in the chaos, and despite her anxiety, Nancy was able to identify a couple of people in this big crowd that she recognized. They were colleagues of Dan's. And so she rushed over to them to ask them questions about where her husband was, what's going on. But as she ran up some stairs to get over to these other colleagues, they saw her coming and all of them just kind of looked away, like they couldn't look her in the eye. Nancy didn't know what to do, but clearly picked up on the signal, and so instead of talking to them, she turned course and went to the nearest police officer. And she said, "My name is Nancy Crampton Brophy. Dan Brophy is my husband. He works here. I can't get in touch with him. Is he okay?" And as soon as she said this, the officers told her to just wait right here. They'll be right back. And then Nancy, she's standing there as these officers leave, and they come back with these two other men who are wearing dark suits. And those men walk up to her and they introduce themselves and they say, "Nancy, we're homicide detectives." And that her husband, Dan Brophy, was the man who was shot on campus, and that he was dead. The next few days went by in a blur for Nancy. She spent basically half her time crying and grieving, and the other half being the person that was sort of in charge of delivering the bad news to friends and colleagues and family about what had happened to Dan. And the reality was, what happened to Dan was still very much up in the air. I mean, the only thing detectives knew at this point was that Dan had been found dead by his students in the kitchen after being shot twice, and that's what killed him. But the school actually didn't have good security camera footage, and so there was no footage to try to indicate who could have come into the classroom and killed him and then left. It was like they didn't really have any good leads, they didn't have any good evidence, and in many ways, it was just this big mystery that didn't appear like it was going to get solved anytime soon. Now, Nancy certainly had her own theory. I mean, she felt like she knew Dan rubbed people the wrong way, and she always had this kind of, basic concern that he was going to make the wrong person mad and they were going to just snap and hurt him someday. And that was definitely a worst case scenario, but here she is, her husband's been killed, he's been shot to death. And so that's what she thought had happened. Maybe it was a student who went crazy and snapped and killed him, or the fact that there was this, burgeoning homeless crisis in Portland and that he was often, or at least recently, interacting with homeless people. And she kind of equated that to being in danger due to the rising drug and criminal activity that was popping up in Portland. And so she had this theory that, basically he had rubbed shoulders with the wrong people and they had killed him over it. She had no way to prove it, but that's what she thought. But instead of really dwelling on what happened to her husband, the reality is over the couple of months following her husband's death, Nancy's life basically fell apart. She wasn't able to focus on anything. It was like her mind had gone blank. It was so traumatic what had happened to her. And so as a result, she couldn't write, so she didn't do any writing. And she also couldn't work. She had to quit her day job because she just could not concentrate on anything. Eventually, Nancy did decide that she would go through and try to sell the house, basically do the plan that she and Dan had thought of to sell it and downsize to get rid of some of this debt. But then she discovered her name was not actually on the deed to the house, and so she couldn't sell it because it technically really wasn't hers. And so now the bank was likely going to foreclose on it because she couldn't afford it. And so again, Nancy's life is just completely upside down. She's totally in debt. She's facing financial ruin. Her husband's been killed. The police have no suspects, no leads. It seems like the case is just going to go cold. And so Nancy just didn't even know what to do. I mean, she was surrounded by friends and family that were there to support her, but there was nothing that anybody could reasonably do to lift her out of this horrible situation she was in. Fast forward to September 5th, so 2 months after Dan had been killed. And Nancy was on her way back to her house, the house that she still couldn't sell, and she had by this point sold a lot of stuff inside of the house just to pay the bills. And she still wasn't working, and she had tried writing a little bit, but still it was like her mind was just blank at this point from all the trauma. And she's on her way home from some errands, and she pulls into the driveway, and as she gets out of her car, she hears another car pull in behind her, and she turns and she sees it's a police cruiser. Now, she had had several interactions with police pretty much immediately following the death of her husband, but for the most part, she didn't really see police officers all that often. And so these two detectives get out of the vehicle and they walk up to Nancy. And so Nancy, she's looking at them expectantly, like clearly this has to do with Dan. Why else would you be here? But she's wondering, maybe there was a break in the case, maybe there's a promising new lead, or they just want to talk to her. She didn't know, but she just stood there and they walked up to her and they told her that there has been a huge break in the case. They found something on the internet that points to exactly who Dan's killer is. It would turn out Dan's killer had actually confessed to their crime on the internet more than a decade before it happened. The killer literally wrote about how all they think about is murder, and that you have to be organized and ruthless and very clever to commit murder, and that, the thing they know about murder is that everybody has it in them if they're pushed far enough. But the most damning thing about the confession was that the killer posted it on a romance blog under the title, How to Murder Your Husband. Dan's killer was his own wife, Nancy. After she wrote that blog post, Nancy would spend the next 10 plus years writing romantic thrillers about powerful women who fell in love and then murdered their enemies. Now, to be clear, Nancy really did love Dan, and she did think they had this beautiful life together. But Nancy ultimately loved writing more than she loved Dan. And so ultimately, Nancy killed Dan basically to, one, live out the sort of fantasy that she played out in all of her novels about these powerful women killing their enemies. And, Dan was not her enemy, but he sort of represented a hurdle between her and the life she wanted, which was to be a writer full-time, which meant she needed more money. And if she killed Dan and got rid of him, she could collect on his life insurance policies and fund the lifestyle that she wanted. And so in a way, there was a parallel there. And so she was able to literally live out a fantasy and also finance this lifestyle that she dreamed of, to be a writer. And so on that day that Nancy was driving around Portland, clearing her mind to think about what she was going to write, she really was doing that. But then she realized her big solve was just go shoot Dan to death in his school, and all your problems are solved. But because Nancy had done all this writing in the years leading up to the crime about how to kill your husband, that was a central theme in a lot of her writing, it made her look really suspicious, and they brought that to Nancy, and quickly, her story fell apart, and she was found guilty. Nancy was ultimately sentenced to life in prison for the murder. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In the early morning hours of March 27, 2003, a 4-year-old boy was lying in bed in rural Ohio when he suddenly heard his door open. Now, he assumed it was just his great-grandparents coming in to check on him, and so, he's a kid, he just pretended to be asleep. But he heard whoever this was make their way across the bedroom because he heard the floorboards creaking, and at some point they were standing right next to his bed. And so curious, the little boy opened his eyes, and what he saw standing next to his bed was not his great-grandparents. It was a huge green monster. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button goes on vacation, do them a favor and paint the entire exterior of their house a blinding neon yellow. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of Wednesday, March 26, 2003, a 55-year-old woman named Linda Myers drove down a secluded 2-lane road in Darke County, Ohio. Darke County was very rural. It was basically just very small towns and farmland. And so as Linda drove down the road, kind of in the middle of nowhere, she looked out her window and she saw the sun setting over a field. She was coming home from the pizza shop that she and her husband Jack owned in a town nearby. Linda eventually turned down a gravel road and onto the sprawling 40-acre farm where she and her husband lived. She parked outside their old farmhouse, and then she grabbed a deposit bag with money from the pizza shop out of the back seat, and then she got out of her car. Their farm was so isolated that she couldn't hear any cars on the road or anything from the neighbors' houses, so it was completely quiet except for the sheep that were bleating in the field and the occasional sound of power tools coming from the barn. She walked around to the back of the barn, and she found Jack hunched over the engine of a beat-up old car. The two of them had been married for about 7 years, and even though this was actually Linda's third marriage, she really felt like Jack was her soulmate. In addition to owning the shop with Linda, the pizza shop, Jack also had a full-time job at a manufacturing plant, and he also had a side business restoring cars. And so Linda often found him out here behind the barn working on a car around the time the sun was going down. And sitting in the grass beside the car, playing with a wrench, was Linda's 4-year-old great-grandson, Damien. And the second Damien saw Linda, he smiled and he got up and he rushed over to her to give her a big hug. And Damien's smile made Linda feel sort of bittersweet. Damien was the son of Linda's granddaughter, Amber. But Amber had gotten pregnant at just 14 years old, and so as a result had not been in any position to take care of a baby. So Linda and Jack had offered to take Damien in and raise him for a few years while Amber finished high school and got on her feet. However, this was definitely not a perfect arrangement for many reasons, but one of those reasons was because Damien's father was furious about being cut out of the custody agreement. Even now, 4 years after, Damien's situation had been decided, the father still argued with Linda about how she wouldn't let him see his son. But Linda felt like as much as he was saying he wanted to be in Damien's life, she felt like at some point he was going to abandon this child, and so she really didn't want him to be around Damien at all. She didn't want her great-grandson to be abandoned like that. And besides, Damien would have another father figure in his life soon enough, because in the past few years, Amber had finished school, she had met a new man, and gotten married. And as soon as Damien finished up this year of preschool in a couple of months, Amber and her new husband were planning to take him in and raise him on their own. Linda was proud of Amber, how she had turned her life around, but she also felt a little sad, bittersweet, because she and Jack were going to miss having Damien around. They loved him. He was basically their son. Linda knew that Jack clearly was busy with his car and kind of didn't want to be interrupted. So she just said a quick hello and then scooped Damien up and carried him over to the farmhouse. She opened up the door and she sat him down and told him to go wash up before dinner. Then she went into the kitchen and she dropped the deposit bag from the pizza shop into a chair in the dining room. The bag was full of cash, and her plan was to drop it off at the bank in the morning. Linda got out a pan and began cooking dinner, and pretty soon her husband Jack came inside, covered in car grease. While Jack washed his hands at the kitchen sink, Linda asked him about his day. And Jack kind of grumbled about this customer that he had sold a car to on a payment plan the previous year, who had now missed 3 payments in a row. Jack said he was going to have to drive out there to the person's house tomorrow and repossess the car. Linda could see, Jack is obviously pretty tense here, but Linda knew it wasn't really that missed car payment that was bothering him. The truth was, Jack had been sort of tense really for the past week, ever since he had had this big argument with his 25-year-old son, Greg. Greg had always been very shy and mild-mannered and really close with his dad. In fact, he was the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding. But recently, Greg's life had been falling off the rails. He was in the middle of a divorce, he was struggling with drinking and drug abuse, and he'd been missing shifts at work. And so earlier that month, he had come by to ask Jack for money because his house was about to be foreclosed on. And Jack had drawn a line and said no. He told Greg that if he wanted to keep his house, he'd have to clean up his act and get back to work. And so that had led to a very big fight. And so now Linda had a feeling that Jack was genuinely worried that he'd done real damage to his relationship with Greg, perhaps irreparably, because something pretty similar had also happened with Jack's other son, Travis. About 7 years earlier, when Travis was 21, he and Jack had gotten into this big argument that was so bad, Travis moved out, and then the two of them had not spoken since for 7 years. So Linda thought Jack must be worried that that would be the same thing that would happen with him and Greg. So while Jack washed his hands, Linda rubbed his shoulders and told him not to worry about Greg. He had a good head on his shoulders, and he just needed a little nudge to get back on track, and that's all Jack had done. She reassured him that he'd made the right call and Greg would get through this rough patch sooner or later. Then Linda set the table and called the family to dinner. A little while later, after they'd eaten and cleaned up, Linda looked up at the clock and realized it was getting kind of late. Damien had preschool in the morning, and she didn't want him to be tired and grumpy. So she scooped him up and took him to his room upstairs to get ready for bed. She helped him change into his PJs, she brushed his teeth, then tucked him in, gave him a kiss goodnight, and closed the door. Linda went back downstairs, and before long, she and Jack were getting ready for bed too. Before long, Linda was in her bedroom, she had turned on a lamp, she had changed into her PJs and crawled under the covers. And then once Jack was settled in next to her, she turned off the light, and they fell asleep. But several hours later, Linda was suddenly woken up by this horribly loud noise, and she sat up and looked around, and when her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, she gasped. The next morning, at a church a mile away from Linda and Jack's house, a preschool teacher was getting ready to start class, but she noticed there was an empty chair in her classroom. One of her students, 4-year-old Damien Huffman, was late. She knew Damien's great-grandparents led busy lives and had several different jobs and businesses, so she figured they must just be running late. So she began class and hoped they would just drop Damien off before he missed too much. And about an hour later, at 9:30 a.m., she was leading the class in morning sing-alongs when Damien suddenly came sprinting into the classroom. Now, at first, the teacher was relieved that Damien had shown up. But then she realized Damien looked frazzled and out of breath, and he didn't have his backpack, and he was wearing PJs, and there was the smear of something brown on his shirt. She ran over to him and knelt down next to him and realized the brown spot was dried blood. The teacher asked Damien what was going on, and he looked at her with this scared, confused expression, and he told her his great-grandparents' faces were melting. Over this past winter break, when myself, my wife, and my 3 kids were home, I was sent this package of My Mochi, which is like ice cream, these little bites of premium ice cream wrapped in this sweet, chewy dough. And I was told, like, hey, try this out, see if you like it, and see if you want to advertise this product. And I'm like, all right, I obviously tried the product, and I am hooked on My Mochi. Like, seriously, I was blown away by how good these things are. I was sent strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. And let me tell you, cookies and cream is out of this world. It's so refreshing. That's the way my wife and I refer to My Mochi, as being like very refreshing. And so we plow through all this mochi we got sent, and literally we went out before this big snowstorm. We went out to the grocery store before it shut down because of the storm, just to buy all the mochi we could. Crushed it. It's so good. It's only 70 calories. It's gluten-free. It's so good, you gotta try it. My Mochi, it's the best. Each purple box comes with 6 perfectly portioned mochi snacks, available in mouth-watering flavors like strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. Cookies and cream, really quite good. Feel joyfully chill with every bite of My Mochi ice cream. Look for the purple box of My Mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store. It's really, really good. About 15 minutes later, a police sergeant named Mark Whitaker, along with his partner, drove down a secluded road toward a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Sergeant Whitaker had been a detective for the Darke County Sheriff's Department for 5 years, and he was in charge of the investigative unit. So when the department had gotten a very strange 911 call that morning from a local preschool, he was sent out to investigate. According to the preschool teacher, a 4-year-old student named Damien Huffman had come into school covered in blood, out of breath, saying something about his great-grandparents' faces being, melting. The teacher identified the great-grandparents as Linda and Jack Myers. Now, Whitaker had no idea what Damien meant when he had said that their faces were melting, or what kind of situation, Whitaker and his partner would be walking into when they got to the farm. But he had a feeling it would not be good. They pulled up to the farm and parked at the end of the long gravel road. And when Whitaker got out of his car, he immediately noticed how eerily quiet it was. There was another farmhouse just across the road and a few more on the horizon, but otherwise they were surrounded by empty fields in every direction. Whitaker began walking towards the front door when he saw the front door was already wide open, but there was no clear sign of forced entry. But nonetheless, Whitaker and his partner reflexively drew their weapons and they stepped inside the house. Whitaker began calling out to see if anybody was home, but there was no response. From where he was standing, he saw there was another open door in the house that led to a set of stairs that went down presumably to the basement. Whitaker ignored the basement for now and instead continued clearing the first floor. So he went into the kitchen, and once he was sure it was clear, he continued down the hallway until he found a doorway that led into a bedroom. And when he went inside that bedroom, he found Damien's great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers, and they were lying in their bed, side by side, and he could tell immediately they were both dead. Now, Jack was actually lying on his stomach, and he could tell right away there was a big bullet wound on the back of Jack's neck. As for Linda, she was on her back, and she had gunshot wounds to her face and her hand, as if she had raised her hand to defend herself before she was shot. And so at this point, Whitaker and his partner did a full search of the house just to make sure nobody else was there, and it was empty. And so the two went back to the bedroom to begin investigating the bodies. Whitaker put on a pair of latex gloves and touched the wound on Linda's face. And the blood was still warm and wet, so he figured likely they'd only been dead for maybe a few hours at most. He looked around the floor, and he didn't see any bullet casings, which meant the killer had gone through the trouble of picking them up afterwards to cover their tracks. Then, Whitaker's partner called his attention to this weird plasticky bundle that was lying on a pillow near Jack's head. Whitaker picked it up, and he saw it was a piece of quilting fabric that was balled up and covered in masking tape. His best guess was that it was a homemade gun silencer. The killer likely taped it to the end of their gun to muffle the sound of the blast, and it must have, blown off at some point when they actually began shooting. Immediately, Whitaker wondered if this was a silencer, why the killer would need one so far out in the middle of nowhere. But when Whitaker left the bedroom and went up a flight of stairs to the room right above where the murders had taken place, he found another bedroom that was full of stuffed animals and toy trucks. It was obviously Damien's room. And it was at this point that Whitaker realized, very likely the killer must have known there was going to be a toddler sleeping right upstairs when they did this. And so they needed the silencer in order to not wake the child when they committed this murder. And so this meant that the killer almost certainly knew Jack and Linda personally. Within minutes, more officers from the Darke County Sheriff's Office swarmed the property. Whitaker went outside to supervise them, and pretty quickly, a forensics officer called him over to look at a set of footprints that they had found in the mud. Whitaker followed the trail of footprints around the side of the house to a basement window. The window pane had been pried off, leaving an open hole that was just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Whitaker crouched down and looked through the open space, and he could see inside there was a set of stairs leading up to the main part of the house. And so he realized this must have been how the killer got inside. And it was also why, when they had first gone inside, that they had seen the door to the basement standing wide open. And so this only made Whitaker more sure that this crime had to have been committed by somebody close to this couple, because the killer obviously knew the layout of Linda and Jack's house. Whitaker told the forensics officer to make a cast of the footprints so they could figure out what type and size of shoe the killer was wearing. And then as Whitaker stood back up, he noticed something else. The phone lines that were running along the side of the house had clearly been severed. The killer clearly had planned ahead and made sure that nobody in this house could call for help. Just then, a truck pulled up at the end of the road, and a woman got out and started walking toward the house. Whitaker quickly went over to stop her from getting too close to the crime scene, and he asked her what she needed. And she said she was a neighbor who lived at the next property over. She said that she had seen the police cars coming down the road, and she didn't really know what was going on, but she felt like she had information that they might want. The neighbor said that around 4:30 that morning, she'd seen a minivan leaving the Myers farm. It had been so dark that she hadn't been able to see what color it was, but it had stuck out to her because as far as she knew, the Myers did not own a minivan. And so hearing this, Whitaker realized, this woman may have seen the killer leaving the property. And if that was true, it meant the murders most likely happened before 4:30 in the morning. And so this was potentially quite useful. And so he thanked the neighbor, and after she left, he went back inside the house to look for more clues. He really wanted to piece together a motive. He felt strongly that whoever had done this knew Linda and Jack, but that doesn't mean that the motive is clear. There could be any number of reasons they would attack them. Maybe it was a robbery. Maybe they were just, getting revenge or something. He didn't know, but as he began walking around the house, he found a literal deposit bag full of cash in the living room, which certainly suggested that this was not a robbery, because that would certainly have been taken. And also there were some pretty expensive electronics in the living room that also had not been touched, so robbery seemed to be out the door. But when Whitaker went back upstairs to take a closer look at the toddler's bedroom, he noticed something odd. there was a little red stain on the bedding that looked like dried blood. While forensics teams were still combing over the farmhouse, another investigator assigned to the case, a guy named Detective Mike Burns, went to the local preschool to speak to 4-year-old Damien. Burns was a father himself, and he felt an immediate connection to this little boy, who at this point looked scared and very confused. Now, he knew it was going to be very difficult for Damien to rehash something that was so traumatic, but Damien was the only potential witness in the house when his great-grandparents were killed. So speaking to him was the police's best bet at figuring out what happened. And so Burns sat down on the floor with Damien inside of a private room, and he asked him to explain what had happened that morning. Damien, in a 4-year-old way, said he'd woken up around 8:45 and the house had been very quiet, so he'd gotten out of bed and went into his great-grandparents' bedroom. And then he said that both of them had been in bed, and he thought they were sleeping. But when he tried to wake them up, they wouldn't move. And then he realized there was blood on their face, and he said he had tried to wipe the blood off with Kleenex wipes. But there was so much of it that he realized something was very wrong. He thought for a second that their faces were melting. And so, to save his great-grandparents, he had run the full mile down the road to his preschool to get help. Burns was surprised that this 4-year-old could remember and articulate so much about such an awful experience. But he was very grateful because the child's story explained why there was blood on Damien's shirt. However, it did not explain why they'd also found blood on Damien's bed. So he asked Damien if he had gone back into his own room after finding his great-grandparents. But Damien said no. He'd gone straight out the front door and gone to his school. Burns thought there had to be more to the story, though, because otherwise he just couldn't explain how blood wound up in Damien's room. So he brought over a dollhouse, and he asked Damien to go ahead and act out everything that had happened the night before, using toys to represent himself and his great-grandparents. Damien put the toy that represented himself into bed in one room, and then he put Jack and Linda into the bed in the other room. And he said everybody went to sleep at their normal bedtimes. But later, in the middle of the night, he heard his bedroom door open, and he said somebody came inside. Burns asked Damien who it was. And Damien paused, and then he said, "The Green Monster." At first, Burns wasn't really sure what to make of this. He wondered if Damien was just imagining things or describing a nightmare or something. But then Damien set the toys down, and then to represent this green monster, he used his fingers to crawl across the floor of the dollhouse toward Damien's bed. Damien said he had heard the door open in his room and he had opened his eyes just a little bit, but he didn't want to give away that he was fully awake, so he was just squinting his eyes. And he said when he did that, he saw the green monster right next to his bed. And the green monster was pointing a gun at him. And Damien was so terrified, he said he shut his eyes and just pretended to be asleep. And then he said when he opened his eyes again, the green monster was gone. After hearing this, Burns realized that Damien's recollection was almost certainly not a dream. More likely than not, Damien had come face to face with his grandparents' killer. They were the Green Monster. After leaving the preschool, the next priority for Detective Burns was to speak to Damien's mother, 19-year-old Amber Holscher. And so the detective drove out to Amber's house, which was in a nearby town, and when he rang the doorbell, she answered right away. Now, at this point, nobody in the family had been notified yet about the murders, so Amber seemed to have no idea why a detective was now standing on her doorstep. Now, Burns knew this, and so he said to her, "Can I please come inside? We need to speak." And so, confused, Amber said okay, and she let him inside, and they sat down in the living room. And then Burns said to her, very gently, that her grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, were no longer with them. But when Amber heard this, she just looked confused and asked what he meant, like, where are they? So Burns took a deep breath and he clarified that they were deceased. Amber looked completely shocked and immediately asked, "Is Damien dead too?" But Burns said, no, he's alive, but he's going to be kept in protective custody for a while in case whoever killed Jack and Linda try to hurt him too. And until they narrowed down the suspects, Damien would not be allowed to see anybody in the family, including her, his own mother. At this point, Amber just began to cry. Burns felt horrible for her, but really he was thinking about Damien. He knew he had to solve this case as quickly as possible because every day that he didn't would be another day that Damien would have to spend alone without any family to comfort him. Based both on Amber's reaction to the news and the fact that Damien did not mention seeing his mother on the night of the murder, Burns thought it was highly unlikely that Amber was a suspect, but she could know something that might help the investigation. So, once she calmed down, Burns asked her if she knew anyone who might have wanted to hurt her grandparents. And right away, she nodded, and she mentioned Damien's father, Andrew Huffman. She said Andrew hated Linda because she wouldn't let him see Damien. In fact, just recently, Andrew had come to Linda's pizza shop and started a fight with her about custody. And it had escalated to the point where Andrew had publicly threatened to kill her. This obviously caught Burns' attention because it made perfect sense as a motive. If Linda and Jack were out of the way, well, Andrew would have an easier time getting custody of Damien. And so he thanked Amber and promised he would be in touch soon. And then as soon as he was back in his car, he called Sergeant Whitaker and he told him what he'd learned. Later that day, Whitaker and his partner made the 2-hour drive to Andrew's address in Newport, Kentucky. When they got there, Andrew quickly came to the door and he let them inside and they sat down and Andrew looked at them like, "What's going on?" And they told him that Linda and Jack had been murdered. And they watched Andrew for his reaction. And he seemed very surprised, but he definitely did not seem upset. Andrew would then admit that he did not get along with Amber's family. And when Whitaker asked him about that big argument at the pizza shop, Andrew did not deny that he had literally threatened to kill Linda. But he swore he would never actually do it. He said it was just an empty threat he made in the heat of the moment. Still, Whitaker thought Andrew looked very suspicious, so he asked him for an alibi. And Andrew said he'd stayed over at a girl's house on the night of the murder, and in the morning he'd stopped by his dad's house and then gone straight to work. And you could ask all those people, and that's where he was. Whitaker wrote all this down and then asked Andrew a few more questions, and then thanked him for his time. And then as soon as the detectives left, they immediately went to go check on Andrew's alibi. They went to that girl's house, then they went to Andrew's dad's house, and then they also went to his place of work, and everybody at those 3 locations all confirmed Andrew's alibi. So unless someone was lying, it left no window of time where Andrew could have driven 2 hours away to Ohio to murder Jack and Linda. Whitaker was disappointed that they'd basically wasted most of the day on this lead that now looked like it wouldn't go anywhere. Especially knowing that, again, every moment in this case that it went unsolved was another moment that Damien would have to spend away from his family all alone. The following morning, Detective Burns, the same officer who had spoken to Damien and also his mother Amber, sat inside of his office feeling very frustrated. He had one goal for the day. He wanted to interview Jack's estranged son, 28-year-old Travis Myers. But it was looking like that was going to be harder than he had anticipated. So the day before, a bunch of sheriff's deputies had interviewed Linda and Jack's family and friends. And family members in particular had mentioned that Travis and Jack had some bad blood. And when Burns had dug through the files on Travis, he found out that Travis also had a criminal record. But there was a problem. It appeared that Travis hadn't even been in Ohio in 7 years. The last anybody in the family had heard, he'd moved to Arizona to live with his mother. But when Burns had called the mother that morning, she said that she actually didn't know where Travis was at all. And there was no other address on record for Travis, so Burns basically had no idea where he was. And so he began to wonder, how was he going to track Travis down? And he decided he should start by visiting Travis's younger brother and Jack's other son, whose name was Greg. Burns knew Greg lived only a few towns over, and even though he really wasn't sure how close the brothers might be, it was the only lead he really had. A little while later, Burns showed up at Greg's house and he knocked on the front door. And a moment later, a young man in a baseball cap answered, and he looked very much like he'd been crying. Burns asked if he was Greg Myers, and the young man nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Greg did not seem remotely surprised by this visit. He said the police had already contacted him the night before to tell him about his father and stepmother's murder, and since then, he said he'd just been waiting for somebody to come by and talk to him, because he'd seen enough TV to know that family members were always the first suspects. But when they got into the living room, Burns stopped in his tracks because there was another young man standing in the doorway, and he looked a lot like Greg. Burns asked who it was, and Greg said, "Oh, that's my brother, Travis." Burns couldn't believe his luck. He'd come here hoping to figure out where Travis might be, But he never imagined he would just find Travis standing in Greg's house. And this was a big development because really until now, Burns had no idea if Travis was even in the state at the time of the murders. But Greg would actually tell him that Travis had been in Ohio for the past several weeks, staying in an apartment that he had rented right nearby. Burns did think the timing seemed very suspicious. It just seemed way too convenient that Travis had come back into town for the first time in almost a decade, right before Jack and Linda were killed. It just seemed too perfect. And also at this point, it just seemed really suspicious that these two brothers are just standing here waiting for police to come question them. Something felt off. So Burns, operating on a gut instinct, told them both that in order to question them, they actually had to come with him to the station and do it formally down there. Less than an hour later, Detective Burns opened the door of the Darke County Sheriff's Office and he showed Greg and Travis Myers inside. Now, neither of the brothers were under arrest yet, but Burns had a feeling that by the end of their interviews, one or both of them could be. Burns took Greg into his office for questioning, while Burns' partner took Travis into a room down the hall. As soon as Greg sat down in front of the desk, Burns noticed that he wasn't making eye contact with him. He was sort of acting shifty. But pretty quickly, Greg said he was perfectly willing to tell the detectives anything they wanted if it could help solve his dad and stepmother's murders. And so Burns immediately began asking questions. He asked Greg what he was doing in the early hours of Thursday morning when Jack and Linda were killed. And Greg told him that mostly he was just asleep. That is, until about 4:30 when he got up to go to his job at a factory that was a few towns over. He also said his girlfriend was at home with him the whole night and she could confirm that. He then said he drove to work in his minivan and he clocked in at 5:23 a.m. And he even had a signed time card back home that would prove it. And Burns was immediately very interested to learn that Greg drove a minivan. Because remember, that neighbor had said she saw a minivan leaving the Myers farm around 4:30 on the morning of the murders, suggesting the killer drove a minivan. However, Burns was starting to realize that even if Greg's alibi were shaky or didn't check out, the timing alone likely ruled him out. It basically was impossible to drive from Greg's house at 4:30 a.m. when he left, go all the way to the farm, commit the murders, then drive to the factory and be able to clock in at 5:23 a.m. when he had his time card stamped. That just wasn't enough time to do all that. And also, pretty much everybody in the family had told Burns that Greg was quite close with Jack and Linda. Now, he was having some problems with drugs and alcohol, but he had no history of crime or violence, and none of his family members thought he seemed capable of being a killer. So even though Greg remained a suspect, Burns decided he would shift his focus to Travis. So Burns asked Greg how had Travis reacted when he heard about Jack and Linda's murders. And he said Travis had been upset, but he'd mostly been concerned about how Greg was coping, because Greg was the one who was much closer to Jack and Linda. Travis was estranged. Greg went on to say that it had been at least 7 years since Travis and his father had spoken, and that those two did not get along at all. Burns asked Greg about that falling out between Jack and Travis, and Greg said it just came down to business disagreements on the farm. He said Travis had felt like his father was cheating him out of money, and they had this big argument that got really ugly, so Travis had just quit the business and moved away. Burns thought about this, and he wondered if maybe Travis stood to inherit any money if his father died. Because if so, that would definitely be a solid motive for murder. And so Burns made two mental notes. One was to look into Greg's alibi, and the other was to look into Jack's will to see how his assets were going to be divided up. After that, he thanked Greg for his cooperation, told him to wait in his office, and then Burns left. And he went right down the hall, and he waited outside the door while his partner finished questioning Travis. Burns' partner would say that Travis had seemed really nervous from the very moment he stepped inside the room. The detective had asked him what he was doing in Ohio, and Travis said he'd just been reevaluating his life recently. And he'd realized that he'd never actually met his brother Greg's children, so he'd come back to Ohio to do just that and spend some time with them. Then the detective asked him what he was doing when Jack and Linda were killed, and Travis stuttered out that he was sleeping in his apartment. The detective asked him if he had anybody who could confirm that, and Travis kind of hesitated and then shook his head and said no. Then the detective asked Travis if he had a car, and Travis said that at the moment he was driving his mother's car, a white minivan. After getting debriefed by his partner about this interview with Travis, Burns went back into his office. By this point, Greg had been moved out and put in a different room. And Burns sat down at his desk and he began going over the evidence they'd collected so far. Now, the investigation to this point had been moving really quickly, and so there actually wasn't a whole lot of evidence yet. In fact, it had only been 24 hours since the forensics were sent to the crime lab, so they were still waiting for results on pretty much everything. Burns knew that at this point, the best thing he could do while he waited for more evidence was go follow up on Travis and Greg's alibis. After all, they are the victims' children, and he already thought that the killer had to be connected personally to the victims, and they both drove minivans, so really either of them could be the killer. But just then, Burns' phone rang. He picked it up, and it was a local man who said he had seen a news report about Jack and Linda's murders, and he had some information that just might help. The man said that a few days earlier, his friend had called him to see if he knew where they could buy a gun. And when this man who's talking to Burns, asked this friend why they needed the gun, the friend said it was because they, quote, wanted to shoot Jack Myers. The man told Burns the name of his friend who said this, and as soon as Burns heard that name, he knew exactly who his murderer was. Based on this phone call, as well as forensic evidence from the crime scene, this is what police believe happened to Jack and Linda Myers on the morning of March 27, 2003. Early on the morning of the murders, the killer woke up and got out of bed and right away put on a green hunting jumpsuit. And they also packed a bag with duct tape, trash bags, and a roll of masking tape. Then they put on a pair of latex gloves and loaded the 12-gauge shotgun that they had purchased from a classified ad 2 days earlier. And they carried all their supplies out to their minivan. After they were ready, they hopped in the driver's seat, turned on the car, and then drove a familiar route through the dark open fields. They were calm at first, until they turned onto the gravel road that led to Jack and Linda's farm. At that point, their heart began to race. Now, the killer felt like they had planned all of this out and prepared for anything that could go wrong. So now, really, all they had to do was just control themselves and just stick to the plan. And so the killer parked right outside the farmhouse, and then while staying in the car, they climbed into the back seat of the minivan, and they grabbed their shotgun. Then they grabbed this thick quilting fabric and they wrapped it around the barrel of the shotgun, and they used masking tape to secure it. That was their DIY silencer. But as they went through this plan, the killer's hands were shaking. They were nervous because as much as they had planned for this, it really was not something they actually wanted to do. But they felt like they had to. So after their gun had its silencer on it, they slung it over their shoulder, then they got out of the van and crept around to the side of the house. And once they were there, they cut the phone lines so nobody inside would be able to call for help. Then they knelt down in the dirt and they pried open the basement window and they climbed inside. Once inside, the killer walked to the stairs, they went up to the first floor, and they walked straight to the bedroom where they knew Jack and Linda would be asleep. They went inside, and there they were, sleeping in their beds, and the killer took a deep breath and then raised their shotgun. They fired a single round into the back of Jack's neck. But the force of the gunshot had blasted off the homemade silencer, and so basically it wasn't silent at all. It was extremely loud, and that homemade silencer landed on the pillow right next to Jack's head. And almost immediately, from the chaos, Linda sat up, and she looked straight at the killer, and she saw what was happening, and she just raised a hand to try to defend herself. And in a moment of panic, the killer just turned the shotgun on her, and they fired twice. And one blast went through her hand, and the other struck her right in the face. At this point, the killer just paused and waited. The silencer had sort of muffled the first shot, but the second two were so loud, they knew that noise easily could have woken up the third person who they knew was in this house, someone they really didn't want to hurt. But if they had to, they would. So, just to make sure they didn't have any loose ends, they left Linda and Jack's bedroom, confident they were dead, and they crept upstairs to little Damien's room. And they went inside, and they carefully walked over right next to the boy's bed, and they raised their shotgun and aimed it at this child, waiting to see if they were awake. But the little boy appeared to be asleep, and so the killer spared him. They lowered their shotgun, and they walked out of the room. Once they were out in the hallway, they shut Damien's door, and then hurried right out of the house. And from there, they got back in their minivan and they sped off. A few miles away, they stopped on a bridge and tossed their gun, their supplies, and their clothes into a river, and then they changed into their work clothes and they drove to the factory, where they would clock in at precisely 5:23 a.m. The killer was Jack's younger son, Greg Myers. Greg had been having problems with money and drug abuse, and his father, Jack, had refused to help him, and they were fighting about it. But Greg knew he would inherit the farm if his father died, and he was so desperate, he decided murder was his best option. When police timed the drive from Jack and Linda's farm to Greg's workplace, they found that he would have actually had just enough time to commit the horrible double murder and then drive straight to work and clock in by 5:23. Greg was ultimately arrested about 48 hours after the crime, so quickly that police were actually still gathering evidence to use against him. They later found the gun, other supplies, and shoes that matched the prints found outside the house in a river right near the farm. And fingerprints and receipts tied all the items back to Greg. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. As for Damien, following the murders, he would go to live with his mother Amber. Despite everything he witnessed at just 4 years old, Amber said in a 2021 documentary that he is now doing very well. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.